Hope you're having a good, we're evening, slowly lowering ourselves into the semester. I hope all the rest of your classes are going well and you're not too overwhelmed at this point. But into the Gilded Age, right? So if you look at the heading for your week 5 module, you'll see that it says 1865 to 1914, right? So these are important dates. And it's something to keep in mind when we look at the rest of our units throughout the semester, right? So 1865 to 1914, what happens then? We have the end of the Civil War up until the beginning of World War I, right? We'll see that movement of these massive, yes, obviously the Civil War is distinctly American, and then obviously we have World War I, World War II, but these are dates that mark, massive changes, right? So we'll see how World War I and World War II and post World War II lead into modernism and realism, and what those questions of belonging and the point of existing means, right? But in 1873, Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner published The Gilded Age, A Tale of Today. The novel, which was Twain's first, portrays the United States as a nation consumed by greed and corruption, a land of get-rich-quick schemes, rampant speculation, and bribery. Twain and Warner filled their pages with Americans, from country villagers to big city dwellers, who were caught up in the fantasy of making an easy fortune, willing to sacrifice their scruples for the sake of material success. Hence the name The Gilded Age, right? So the book revealed an age that too easily mistook gilding for gold. So if you don't know what gilding is, right, you can have a piece of gilded jewelry and it's gold plated, essentially, right? So what Twain and Warner are saying by titling this novel The Gilded Age about this era in the United States is that it's not perfect and it's not great, right? It appears that way on a surface level, but if you go beneath that, you know, everything is not set in stone. Everything's not perfect. Um, Twain especially would argue as the years went on that it wasn't just something worth less than gold, but something that was rotting. Um, it was a period encompassing the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th, witnessing questions about racial equality and violence, debates over the role of immigrants in the United States, anxiety about shifting gender roles throughout the country, and concerns about the accumulation and concentration of wealth. All of ideas which we are still dealing with today. And, especially in the last 5 years, have become more and more blatant, right? So, I understand the desire to, maybe just do the readings and skip over historical context, but with every piece that we look at, we try to relate older writing to our modern world, right? It's a time period that's incredibly similar. And if this is reconstruction, hopefully, that actually is what happens. So the Civil War transformed the lives of the 4 million African Americans who obtained their freedom through slavery, but the costs were staggering. The combined death toll from the Union and Confederate armies equaled more than 620,000 soldiers, which was about 2% of our population at the time. And historians have offered a conservative estimate of an additional 50,000 civilian casualties. It's probably much more than that, mostly in areas that declared secession from the Union, right? That's an important thing to consider as well. Um, Confederate states had a stronger number of losses, right? So it's probably far more than that. Now, Reconstruction is often taught as a period of retribution against the rebellious southern states, or as a period of reconciliation between the North and the South. Um, when I was in high school, I had a teacher that said that um, if you go to the South, people refer to the Civil War as the War of Northern Aggression. And I kind of believe that my whole life until I moved to Alabama. And then you talk to people and they're like, I've never heard of that before. Um, so it is interesting to consider perspective, right? You know, and not necessarily not to, dismiss other people's perspectives, but almost to consider how people perceive the other, right? The person that they disagree with. And we'll find out continuously throughout this course that that is really what drives division. Um, and a lot of the writers that we will look at are trying to rectify or reconcile that idea. But when often goes overlooked are the challenges of Black Americans to fully claim the freedoms promised by the emancipation from slavery. As challenging and unprecedented as the Reconstruction of the South was, it was entwined with an even larger and more fundamental one. What would be the status and rights of the newly emancipated people, and indeed everyone in the United States? As explained by Frederick Douglass in these powerful quotes from a 30-year period surrounding the Reconstruction era, African American rights were never guaranteed by emancipation, right? While white Northerners and Southerners experienced Reconstruction as a season of reconciliation, for Black Americans throughout both the North and the South, it was an ongoing struggle to realize the promise of citizenship and equality. So we have three Reconstruction Amendments, and the three Reconstruction Amendments were designed to further the work begun in 1863 by the Emancipation Proclamation. In 1865, the 13th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution was ratified, which abolished slavery and involuntary servitude, right? So the 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, granted citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the United States, excluding Native Americans who were members of tribal nations, and guaranteed all citizens equal protection of the law. So the 14th Amendment states that if you are born in the United States, you are a citizen of the United States. The 15th Amendment, which was ratified in 1870, extended suffrage to Black American men by prohibiting racial discrimination in voting, which was a landmark achievement that had been unthinkable at the outbreak of the Civil War. Right? Notably, the 15th Amendment did not offer ballot to women, and it created a cleavage between some white proponents of women's rights and supporters of African American suffrage, right? Voting rights. As that development demonstrates, the debate surrounding these amendments and other pieces of legislation forced Americans to consider basic questions about the nature of citizenship, the relationship of the federal government to the states, and the meaning of equality itself. So, really, the 15th Amendment opened up more questions than it did give answers or conclusions, right? So, okay, it's not just white men that can vote now. Now we have black men can vote. Um, Native Americans still can't vote, and women of any race can't vote, right? So it opens up, to use a idiom that doesn't really do any justice, a much larger can of worms than it helps. But it's also important to consider the fact that, I mean, this is how change occurs, right? You point out flaws in ideas, you point out flaws in concepts, and hopefully they end up being rectified and expanded and expounded upon, and um, everyone just becomes more and more equal, right? As we will see slowly and not really happen as the semester goes on. So, Jordan Anderson um, wrote a letter of a freedman to his old master, and it's an incredibly unique document in the literature of the Reconstruction era. Anderson was a formerly enslaved man whose former master had asked him and his wife to return to the Tennessee farm where they were once enslaved. Anderson's reply both displays cutting wit and bears witness to the pain that he and his family endured while enslaved. By calculating the compensation that he believes he and his wife should receive, Anderson speaks to a cultural question that emerged during Reconstruction and remains with us to this day. What were the emancipated people and their descendants owed? Now, I didn't assign this to you. You should absolutely read it. It's incredibly short. Just pull it up. But essentially, the letter addresses a variety of different audiences, right? So the first is Anderson's former master, Colonel P.H. Anderson of Big Spring, Tennessee, but the letter was also published in the Cincinnati Commercial, the New York Daily Tribune, and the Freedman's Book, an 1865 volume of text about the experiences of slavery and emancipation edited by abolitionist Lydia Mary Child. Child's purpose in editing the Freedman's Book, as explained in the text opening pages, was for recently emancipated African Americans with the hope that those of you who can read will read it aloud to others, and that all of you will derive fresh strength and courage from this true record of what colored men have accomplished under great disadvantages. Right? So, with Child's purpose in mind, how could the letter as a whole and the excerpt on this slide in particular serve to provide fresh strength and courage? Consider Anderson's self assurance in asking for reparations for the labor performed during the period of his wife and his wife Mary's enslavement. By calculating the period of his and his wife Mary's enslavement, Anderson speaks to compensation that he believes he and his wife should receive. Anderson speaks to a central question that emerged during Reconstruction and remains with us to this day. What were the emancipated people and their descendants owed? Right? Now, um, again, you should absolutely check it out. It's great. It's essentially a giant fuck you, right? Because his previous owner asks him to come back and work for him, and he says that he'll pay him, and he essentially does some math, figures out how much he thinks he's owed for the time that he was enslaved and his family, and was like, I'll come back if you give me this much money, and there's a list of caveats. And then at the end, he says, say howdy to George Carter and thank him for taking the pistol from you when you were shooting at me. So essentially, it's a giant middle finger to his previous owner, who, for whatever reason, thinks that he's going to come back, right? And he's just like, yeah, you can pay me, knowing that's not going to happen. And then his closing statement is like, oh, and also, hey, thanks that guy, thank him for not shooting me, right? Because he took the gun away from you, because that's his last memory of escaping, right? Is getting shot at. So why in the world would I come back? It's not even a page long. You should definitely pull it up and check it out. It's a really great um, firsthand account. So, um, in their quest to rebuild the United States, Americans in the post Civil War era looked in a variety of directions for the resources needed for renewal. Abroad, for immigrant populations that would provide the labor necessary for economic growth; to the West, where land, minerals, and other natural resources seemed to be abundant; and to the South, where the deconstruction left by the war created opportunities for entrepreneurial investors. Finally, by the turn of the 20th century, Americans were looking to foreign lands in a new way, as the United States sought to claim its place on the world stage as an imperial power. What united these disparate energies was a drive for material prosperity, an unquestioned belief in economic progress, right? So we as a country are trying to build ourselves back up. We're trying to come together in one way or another, as Whitman again begged for in Lilacs. But also, we need to build ourselves up economically, right? The country's destroyed. Now, in particular, obviously, the South is destroyed and half of it's burnt to the ground. Um, and obviously, there's that resentment and hatred at the time, which still exists to this day. And how do we kind of reconcile all of that, right? It seems like an impossible feat after a collapse, right? Um, Now, the statistics for population growth in the post-bellum United States are fairly staggering, right? With the exceptional growth coming largely from immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe, which is going to be Russia, Poland, Italy, and Balkan nations. Whereas prior to the Civil War, the majority of U.S. population was centered in rural areas. Following the Civil War, most Americans lived in cities such as New York and Chicago. As an example, New York grew from a population of half a million to nearly 3.5 million between 1865 and the turn of the 20th century. So, 35 years, it that's a massive increase for one city, right? Chicago, with a population of only 29,000, which is wild to consider, in 1850 had more than 2 million inhabitants by 1910. 29,000 people in Chicago in 1850. The population of Florence is about 40,000. So at the time, Chicago was the size of Florence or smaller, right? So, I mean, that's how much the country has grown. And if you really sit back for a second and take it into consideration, it's pretty wild. Now, this is a picture of Cornelius Vanderbilt's residence circa 1894, right? William Vanderbilt, who made his fortune in the shipping and railroad industry, had 3 mansions built on the block between 51st and 52nd Street in New York City. Juxtapositions became increasingly common in big cities like New York as the disparity between the rich and the poor grew exponentially. Again, something we are still seeing today. Here is a picture of poor immigrant children sleeping in Mulberry Street in New York City, which, if you have not been there, is in Little Italy. And then we get to the question of industrialization, right? So men and women so busily in New York City tenements, sweatshops down on Ludlow Street, which is in the Lower East Side. This is circa 1889. Immigrants and newcomers to the city often worked in situations like this, where jobs were plentiful and wages poor. The growth of industry and the urbanization of the United States were fueled by unprecedented levels of immigration. In 1870, the U.S. population was 38.5 million. By 1910, it was 92 million. By 1920, it was 123 million. A large percentage of this increase came from the arrival of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe. Again, Russia, Poland, Italy, right? Though these new Americans were crucial to the prosperity of the nation, they were also a source of anxiety to some. Doesn't sound very different than anything going on today. Here is a picture of young boys working throughout the night at Indiana Glass Works, right? This is a famous photo by Louis Wicks Hine. The National Child Labor Committee, an organization whose goal was to end child labor, was formed in 1904, but it was not until 1938 that the Fair Labor Standards Act, put an end to child labor in the United States. So, less than 100 years ago. Here we have a picture of immigrants emigrating into the United States at Ellis Island, right? Statue of Liberty. The Ellis Island Immigration Station, which opened in 1890, represents the common immigrant experience for Europeans in the late 19th century. The immigration station, shown here, served as the port of entry for millions of immigrants from Europe before the federal government restricted immigration in 1924. In its busiest year, 1907, more than 1 million immigrants entered the United States through Ellis Island. We just have a political cartoon about immigration anxieties, right? Again, nothing has changed, right? People over 100 years ago were terrified about immigrants coming into the country, and yet they came, and yet our workforce flourished, right? I know this is jumping around a lot. That's the only way it's not going to be 3 hours long. So, but here we have a feast day at Acoma, right, which is a famous photo by Edward S. Curtis. It was taken in 1904. In 1892, Curtis opened a studio in the Washington Territory and began to photograph local Native Americans. Curtis traveled widely, portraying Native people in scenes in an elegiac manner, attempting to document what he understood to be the last days of the, in quotes, vanishing Indian. Whatever his intentions, a feast day at Acoma shows a bustling scene of Pueblo people in the Southwest. The Homestead Act of 1862 promised free or cheap acreage to every individual or family who would settle and improve, in heavy air quotes, land according to a set formula. But much of the available land was donated to railroads to encourage expansion, right? Westward expansion. Now, for American Indians living in the western half of the continent, the expansion of the United States further threatened their political and cultural autonomy. From the time of the earliest treaties with the United States, native nations had agreed to cede larger tracts of land with some territory specifically reserved for themselves. The United States Department of the Interior, right, advertised this piece offering Indian land for sale. The man pictured in this ad is a Yankton Sioux named Not Afraid of Pawnee, and in 1887, the Congress approved the Dawes Severalty Act, which set in motion a process for dissolving the communal land holdings of tribal reservations and assigning smaller parcels of land to individual Indians, right? So, end quote. What happens when you take a space that a group of people own and you systematically break it down and you give it away to an individual as opposed to a group? It becomes easier to take away after that, right? That's the whole point. Something else to consider. Now, to change gears, yeah, it's not the only thing changing and expanding in our country at the time, right? This is a literature class, not a history class. So it is important to consider the expansion of the availability of literature, right? So during this period, the center of the growing publishing industry migrated from New England to New York, not very far at all in the span of the country itself, but commercial publishing also became a more professional and specialized enterprise. Um, Prior to this, as I had mentioned when we were discussing Whitman, right? Once publishing started to become more of an American institution, we weren't really constricted by kind of romantic and European norms and fashions in writing, right? It's why Whitman could write in a distinctly American dialect. Um, and his work wasn't published in Europe. Um, Again, I know this is prior to the course, but Edgar Allan Poe, for example, right? Everybody knows Poe. Poe was widely published, specifically in France, because he was working within the confines and barriers of accepted French literature at the time, right? So everyone loved what he was writing, so it got published, right? They're like, oh, look at this American that can write these stories as well as we do. There was also a time period where there were legitimately literary pirates that would go across the Atlantic, essentially like smuggling manuscripts, which is, neither here nor there, but very interesting. But during this period, um, American reading as a whole in the public grew, right? So, publishing houses increasingly focused on different segments of the literary marketplace and devised new methods to excite publicity and increase sales, as anyone that's trying to make money would. The turn of the 20th century fostered the rise of literary celebrity in the United States, most obviously epitomized by Mark Twain, and then later, like authors such as Jack London, who we will look at later this week, Hemingway, Gertrude Stein, and Mark Twain, right? Twain becoming a public figure whose actions and words were reported regularly on in newspapers and in the press, and he was arguably the most recognizable American in the world for several decades. Yeah. To move gears again, let's talk about the Transcontinental Railroad, right? This comes more into play when we'll read To Build a Fire later this week. The Transcontinental Railroad, which was completed in 1869, facilitated travel across the United States and contributed to the closing of the frontier, right? Now, to build a fire really has to do with the frontier expansion, but there is an overlap. This is an image from the Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit in Utah on May 10th in 1869. Now, the woman question, right? So, this is a photograph from a pre-election suffrage parade in New York City taken on October 3rd in 1915, in which 20,000 women marched. Now, the woman question, to use a common phrase from the period, was actually more than a single question, right? So it was a host of issues that related to education, participation in the workforce, and the social influence of women on issues such as temperance, right? So although marriage and motherhood define the conventional roles for women in the popular imagination, changes in divorce laws during the 1890s fueled debates about female autonomy and the institution of marriage. The chief political issue identified with women during this period was suffrage, right? The right to vote. Proponents of female suffrage were bitterly disappointed by the 1870 ratification of the 15th Amendment of the Constitution, right? Remember, which said that any man could vote regardless of race, which, at least in theory, extended the voting franchise to African American men, but not women of any race whatsoever, right? So, membership in the National Women's Suffrage Association, founded in 1869, grew dramatically in the late 19th century. Now, the 19th Amendment, which was passed in 1919, gave the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. So the 19th Amendment gave women the right to vote. Again, a little over 100 years ago. So, that is the conclusion of the kind of historical contexts of this lecture. But now we have to talk a little bit about realism and naturalism, right? Before you jump in to your readings for the week. Realism, right? Now, remember, American Romanticism, its three kind of fundamental tenets are an appreciation for nature, right? Which leads to a potential form of spirituality and a concept of the sublime in one way or another, etc. Now, realism kind of switches everything up, right? So, in a nutshell, realism is all about accurately depicting the emotional and moral dilemmas, and this is an important part, of middle class to upper class characters, right? That will end up being one of the major distinctions between realism and naturalism, is kind of what class of person is being written about. But though authors such as Mark Twain were more interested in the working class, rural class characters than he was with the urban elite, right? So Twain also located realism in the language patterns of his characters, drawing upon a long tradition of vernacular storytelling, right? Which attempted to recreate the speech patterns of everyday people, which can also be called regionalism, right? Um, Something that Whitman strove for, but as we absolutely saw in Strange Visual I Held in the Field One Night, he kind of let go of as he got older, right? We can see him return back to more kind of classical language, right? Remember, we were talking about his use of Latinate syntax and how he was almost writing, well, not almost, was in some lines writing in English but in Latin syntax, which can make his work a little bit more confusing, harder to understand, and also kind of moot the purpose of his earlier work and vision, which was to make a particularly American style of writing, right? I mean, if anything, we can give him free verse for that. But realism is really where we start to see um, an American, a truly American voice um, come into view in terms of published literature, right? So, realism is a literary movement and technique practiced by many schools of writers, right? It's still used today, but as a movement, it's expanded. When we get to modernism and postmodernism essentially, we'll see how all of these movements, romanticism, realism, naturalism, modernism, all kind of like meld and form together. And then that is just like the explosion that is postmodernism. But this is a very kind of locked in its lane movement of writing, right? So its major hallmarks are, though, it denotes a particular class as subject matters, right? Upper to middle. Um, and it's a reaction against romanticism, which is the most important part, right? So we looked at some American romantics, and this is the backlash, essentially, at that. Um, it has more of an interest in the scientific method and how our minds work, right? And the importance of kind of documenting everyday life. Now, obviously, we could argue that Twain and Dickinson are doing that, but this is supposed to be more relatable, right? And sure, maybe, these are short stories. It's prose, it's not poetry. I get that poetry can be unrelatable for 1,000 different reasons to people. Maybe because it's too esoteric, it's too vague, it's too in an author's head. Realism as a movement is really meant to kind of speak to everyone, right? So, where romantics transcend the immediate to find the ideal, which I think we could all agree with. Um, even when lilacs last and the dooryard bloomed is very much so. It doesn't transcend the immediate in the sense of dealing with Whitman's grief, but it does, in a short 6 pages, kind of get to an idealistic conclusion, right? Is that we could and should do our best to come together again as a country, which is an idealistic point of view, inarguably. Realism, on the other hand, is really just, I mean, it's what it is. It's trying to show things exactly how they are, right? So many critics have suggested that there is no clear distinction between realism and its related late 19th century movement, naturalism, which, as we'll see, we can completely disagree with. But as Donald Pizer notes in his introduction to the Cambridge Companion to American Realism and Naturalism, the term realism, it can be difficult to define, right? In part because it is used differently in Europe, contextually, than in American literature. And Pizer suggests that whatever was being produced in fiction during the 1870s and 1880s that was new, interesting, and roughly similar in a number of ways can be designated as realism, right? And that an equally new, interesting, and roughly similar body of writing produced at the turn of the century can be designated as naturalism. Now, in hindsight, this is an outrageous statement. They are very different. Um, in American literature, the term realism encompasses the period of time from the Civil War to the turn of the century, right? Naturalism comes after that. So we can break it up in terms of time period. Also, as the United States grew rapidly after the Civil War, the increasing rate of literacy, the rapid growth of industrialism and urbanization, and an expanding population base due to immigration, in addition to a relative rise in middle class affluence, provided a fertile literary environment for readers interested in understanding these rapid shifts in culture, right? So people are more educated. Um, they have more money. They have more access to the arts, right? So why not get whatever you can out of it, right? So we've seen this throughout history, going back hundreds and hundreds, if not 1,000 years, right? We have the Gutenberg Bible, right? The dawn of the printing press. Yes, literature was more accessible, but you had to be able to read, right? You had to be literate. Um, and we see a small rise in that in Europe during and post Renaissance, and obviously people found ways, even when illiterate, to hear stories through oral tradition where people would tell each other stories. Um, but with more access to education, more access to print, right? Newspapers, books, poetry, etc., more and more people have these ideas available to them. And in a lot of ways, this is the catalyst for the explosion that we're going to see over the next couple weeks in writers from different backgrounds, from different socioeconomic groups, right? So, as more people gain access to education, to the ability to have these texts in their hands and to discuss them with other people and learn and debate, um, we see a surge of ideas, right? We see um, just an explosion, essentially, of thought, right? And that's why, in a lot of ways, scholars consider this to be the beginning of not a gilded, but a golden era of American literature, right? A lot of it has to do with the type of writing that is being produced, but if you look at the reason behind that writing being produced, it's that now people that have not had access to be able to write or to even read or leisurely or scholarly, right? It's expanding. Um, and that is really why we get some of the greatest literary voices of our country in this era, right? Is that, it's not just the elites in the upper echelon of our country that have access to literature and access to education. It's starting to expand. Um, Hence, we have different experiences, different ideas. And realism really was a movement that encompassed the entire country, right? But the major characteristics of realism is that it renders reality closely and in a comprehensive detail, right? So just being as realistic as possible. Its character is more important than action and plot. Complex ethical choices are often the subject. So, that means that we're focusing a little bit more on what's going on, right, in our characters' lives, in their heads, right? They're not necessarily driven by story, but the story is driven by characters, is kind of a good way to think about it. Characters appear in their real complexity of temperament and motive. They are in explicable relation to nature, to each other, to their social class, to their own past. So, what does that mean? Um, Again, people are being written as fully fleshed out characters, essentially, right? Which I know can kind of be hard to grasp, but you know, relate it to, something that you've read or something that you've watched, a series that you like. A lot of times you'll watch like a crappy series and the characters are flat, right? Um, you don't care about them because they don't feel fleshed out and full, right? Realism is really where this idea of having fully fleshed out characters and you not only care about where the story is going, but you care about the character because you know about the character, right? That really is an idea that comes out of realism, right? And again, the idea of the importance of class. Um, Realist novels are traditionally serving the interests and aspirations of the middle class, right? Um, what's also important is events will usually be plausible, right? Plausible as in realistic. They avoid sensationalism, as we'll see, right? These more dramatic elements of naturalism and naturalistic violence. And also, in terms of like a classic kind of romance story. And again, diction, right, is going to be in a more natural vernacular or a more regionalist vernacular. It's not meant to be heightened, it's not meant to be poetic. Um, It's meant to be relatable. Again, right? Realism's purpose as a literary movement is to be relatable, right? And not just relatable to the upper class, but also to the middle class as well, and at least people that are educated and have the opportunity to be able to go to school and learn how to read and become illiterate, etc. Now, naturalism is a little easier to categorize in a lot of ways, only because it has much more specific boundaries set up for it as a movement. Um, Now, as we discussed before, even though naturalism is often summarized as an offshoot of realism, there are differences so great as to make these movements almost seem opposite to one another, right? Now, if we look at this list again, right, has to do with being realistic and relatable, and it involves the middle class. And those could be our nutshell sum ups, essentially, for realism. Naturalism, on the other hand, one began in the late 19th century, right? So we have that time period shift. Um, but it also is characterized by determinism, right? Determinism in the sense that there is always in a naturalist story something that must get done, right? And it usually always involves survival. So that's an important thing to consider. Um, Detachment, but detachment in the sense of being detached from the general population, being isolated, right? Um, Now, when we look at to build a fire, obviously you have a character that is completely isolated other than his companion, which is a wolf dog hybrid. But there are other pieces in the anthology, like Stephen Crane's The Open Boat, which involves a handful of sailors that are escaping a sunken ship and trying to make it to shore, but they are detached from the rest of civilization. Um, we have this idea of a scientific objectivism, which is another really large one, right? It's the concept that, and this goes kind of hand in hand with the indifference of nature, but people are thinking more about Darwinism and evolution and the fact that, right, objectivism as opposed to subjectivism is a fact versus an opinion, right? So we have stories that are based in hard truths and hard realities, right? You'll see in To Build a Fire how much Jack London spends his time talking about how cold it is, right? And the difference between like 10 degrees and how much colder that is, but also how much quicker that will kill you and how much faster it will, if you salivate, like freeze your mouth shut. Um, so we have these ideas that come into play. Um, Social commentary comes into play in the sense that naturalism also, in terms of subject matter, focuses not necessarily on the lower class, but on people that would most likely be part of the lower class, but people that are living on the fringes of society, right? Um, Sailors that are out at sea for 6 months, trappers that are trying to cross a massive expanse with a half-wild dog with them as their only means of survival and companionship. So, um, it is naturalism is much more isolating, right? And that's kind of the point. Um, and that relates back to the idea of determinism, right? If you are completely left to your own devices to survive and make it through an ordeal, um, you have to be determined, right? Because no one's going to help you. And the idea that no one's going to help you really leads into the indifference of nature, which is one of the major rejections of Romanticism. Um, both European and American, is the idea that in Romanticism, um, you can find awe and in nature. You can be helped by nature. It can comfort you, right? Think of how the thrush comforts Whitman and when lilacs last in the dooryard bloomed. That doesn't exist in naturalism, right? Nature is separate from man in naturalism, and um, it doesn't care about you, right? It's there. The wilderness is the wilderness. Snow is snow. A raging sea is nothing more than a raging sea, and it's something not to conquer, but something to survive. Um, is a pretty big idea in naturalism. So, like Howell and his fellow realists, literary naturalists felt that they had an obligation to bring social conflict to the page. But they found Henry Dean Howell and his followers too mild and too focused on the manners of the professional and upper class, right? So naturalists looked lower. Naturalists thought that realism had left literature bloodless by failing to depict the genuine violence that they saw everywhere, right? In the ruthless modern world, they sought to explore how biology, environment, and other material forces shaped lives, focusing particularly on lower class people who had less control over their lives than those who were better off, right? People that are put in dire situations because they don't have any other options. Which, again, that extension of naturalism is something that we still see today in some of the best novels and best stories and best series and best films, etc. Um, Naturalism, we'll see as a movement, introduces characters from the fringes and the depths of society, far from the middle class, whose lives really do spin out of control, right? Their fates are seen to be the outcome of degenerate heredity. Um, of a sordid environment and it really just kind of bad luck that can often seem to control the lives of people without money or influence, and a lot of times people that, again, kind of are on the fringes of society that no one cares about. Um, so if no one cares about you, you have to do everything on your own, right? And we'll see that idea not only come up in our naturalist characters, but also in the themes and ideals expressed by Jack London in To Build a Fire. So I will say that in To Build a Fire, we consider the relationship between the trapper and the dog. And think about it as a gigantic metaphor about naturalism, and try to pick apart when you read it how London is using the relationship between the man and the wolf dog to explain naturalism to his readers. It's the reason we're looking at To Build a Fire and not The Open Boat by Stephen Crane. Is that what London does here is he takes conceit, right? Remember, which is an extended metaphor that runs through a whole piece of literature, um, which in this case would be the dog and how the dog represents, symbolizes uh, the concepts and ideas and ideals of naturalism. So keep that in mind when you do your reading. Sorry, I'm still getting over being sick. And I will post your uh, Kate Chopin and Jack London overviews later today. All right, everyone, enjoy your week. Email me if you have any questions, and have a good